Hello, I'm Stacy Campbell, Agriculture Extension Agent with the Cottonwood Extension District in Barton and Ellis County. And today we've got a special guest with us, Charlie Lee. He's one of our K-State Wildlife Extension Specialists, and I say one, you're our one and only Wildlife Extension Specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and Charlie's based out of Manhattan. And we appreciate Charlie coming out to Hayes today. And we're going to talk about management of Kansas fish ponds. Charlie, I think you're going to kind of hit on 3 or 4 major things. The first is, what constitutes a pond in Kansas, a fish pond. Then we're going to go into management of the fish in the pond, aquatic vegetation or weed control, and then animal problems that might be out there in our fish ponds as well. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Charlie, and let you go into talking about the first part of what we're going to talk about, what are ponds in Kansas.
Okay, we'll just go ahead and get started. Get a lot of questions about farm ponds in Kansas. Sometimes I get the questions primarily because people are having problems with ponds. So we start with a definition of ponds. Ponds are just an impoundment that's made when you dam water up from surface runoff, or you're intercepting springs or stream flow, or in some cases impounding well water. Usually 1 to 10 acres in size. Things that are more than 10 acres, I tend to move over into the lake category. And typically, I like to see a pond that's at least 8 feet deep during the dry part of the year. Most of the ponds we're going to talk about are privately owned ponds. Historically, our ponds were developed so we had a steady source of water for humans and livestock. But currently, we seem to see more use of farm ponds for recreation. That includes fishing, hunting, occasionally camping, and then other folks just want the aesthetics of what a beautiful farm pond might be. But farm ponds that operate correctly and require careful management. And that careful management starts with a proper stocking strategy. We've got to have the right environmental conditions to make a pond work. We've got to have good fish harvest and growth, successful fish reproduction, elimination of unwanted fish species if they happen to get into the pond. Sometimes we need to worry about vegetation control, but ultimately, success of your pond is going to depend upon the site that's chosen where you built the pond.
Okay.
One thing that we see here in Kansas is that many farm ponds were built for the purpose of watering livestock. That's great, but I like to see those ponds fenced out to keep livestock away from the water. There are many adaptations that can be made. If you don't have a way to water livestock with a pipe through the dam to a tank down below, there are some cost share opportunities for some of those type of facilities. But I've never yet seen a pond that was improved with having livestock water out of it. Typically, livestock are going to cause some problems with increased erosion on ponds.
And Charlie, from your graph there, putting that water tank down below the dam, that may seem like a complicated thing, but really it's a pretty inexpensive, easy fix, is my understanding.
It can be, if it's put in at the time the pond is constructed, it's very inexpensive and easily to be done. It's a little more of a task after the dam is already constructed.
Okay.
One of the problems I see with farm ponds is many of them don't have a good spillway system. And what I consider a good spillway system, first you need an emergency spillway, then you need a principal spillway, and many principal spillways only transfer water off of the top of the pond. Ponds that are built with a bottom withdrawal spillway seem to function much better. Then when new water is coming into the pond, oftentimes it's after a big rainfall event, it's silt laden, it's a little bit cooler water that's entering the pond. Since it's cooler, it's denser, it goes down to the bottom of the pond, and a bottom withdrawal spillway will help flush some of that silt and other debris sedimentation that's gathered on the pond bottom out and pass it through the spillway system. It's going to greatly increase the life of your farm pond with the bottom withdrawal spillway. We don't have a lot of those in Kansas. Okay. Some other states have done a good job of putting bottom withdrawal spillways in, And I think that eventually we'll get there, and I would encourage people that are building new ponds to think about adding a bottom withdrawal spillway rather than a straight through pipe or a drop down structure for a principal spillway.
Okay. Okay. So I know fish, I just learned today talking with you, really there's kind of 3 primary fish that you like to see in a pond. Here in Kansas, I guess, if a person's wanting to have more than that, what would you say to that?
Well, most times I only recommend a very simple stocking strategy for most small ponds in Kansas. I like to start with a bluegill, largemouth bass, and channel catfish. Typically, I'm going to put in 500 bluegill fingerlings per surface acre. That in the fall of the first year. Then I'll skip that winter, next spring, and then put in the bass, 100 largemouth bass fingerlings and 100 channel catfish fingerlings in that year 2 in the fall. Then if you start with that type of a system, you're going to have a lot higher rate of success than if you try putting in adult fish from somewhere. Maybe you don't know the source of those fish. They could have some diseases. It could be some other species in there. So I encourage people to start with fingerlings that have been purchased from a reputable dealer. Then you need some sort of a harvest system. Typically people want to start fishing immediately. That's quite all right, but most of the time these are going to be very small fish. I don't like to see bass removed that are less than 15 inches for at least 3 years to allow the population, those predators, to get up and growing. After that, I like to have a 12 to 15 inch range that is protected. So I'm not keeping those fish that are from 12 to 15 inches in length. And then you need to be concerned about how many bass you take out of a pond. I don't like to see more than about 20 to 25 pounds of bass per acre per year that are removed from the pond. And let's say you have a 1 acre pond, that's 4 to 5 big fish. That's about all you need to be able to take out of that pond, or you're going to remove too many of those larger fish, which are very efficient predators.
Okay.
Bluegill, something that some people like to fish for. It's a great species to get young kids interested in fishing. They're quite easy to capture. Usually those aren't harvested adequately in farm ponds. I encourage people to try to remove at least 30 pounds of bluegill per acre per year. And channel catfish, there are a lot of people that are interested in channel catfish. They're a very easy fish to catch. They're quite tasty. You can harvest them as many as desired because they're not likely to reproduce in most farm ponds. But when you replace channel catfish, you need to replace them with 8-inch fish or greater in order to avoid bass predation. Other folks ask, how do we monitor what size and type of fish we have in the pond? And the best technique is simply getting out there and regularly fishing in the pond, keeping track of what you're capturing and the effort it's take to capture those fish and the size and species of fish that you capture. You need to ask yourself some questions when you're trying to figure out whether your pond is being managed properly. Like, is the average size of the bluegill that you're catching, is that declining? What's the largest size of bluegill that you catch each year? And is that largest bluegill, is that getting smaller? Do you catch fewer big fish? Okay. Are the bass that you're catching being caught less frequently? And then what about other species? Has somebody else maybe purposely or inadvertently stalked fish into your pond that you didn't know about, or a fish washed out from other ponds up in the watershed and you get some unwanted species in your pond, like perhaps yellow bullhead or carp?
Okay.
You need to record the fish harvest. This seems fairly easy, but I find very few producers actually do this.
Right.
But it's pretty easy to put a book there in some sort of a waterproof container.
Oh, okay.
So when people come in to fish with you or with someone else and you're not there, they can record the species that they captured, the size, the number, the date, and the water conditions. Those last two are just kind of for personal information. But you really need to know what species you're catching and the size of the fish that you're catching in order to know whether you need to make changes in the way you're managing your pond.
Maybe have an old mailbox there that you can keep those records in.
Whatever it takes to keep records, and it doesn't take very long at the end of the day to figure out what you caught and record it.
Okay, yeah.
Remember that a pond management's really a balancing act. The pond fishery can be established with that initial stocking, but maintaining that stocking is going to require you to manage the harvest.
Okay.
And that's really critical for farm ponds.
Okay, Charlie, we appreciate that. That kind of concludes our first section about the ponds and the fish management of it. And then here in a minute, we'll go into the next part of our program on this, which will be, I believe, the aquatic vegetation and weed control. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to know about that because most fish ponds seem to get weed problems. So we'll be right back and talk about how we manage the aquatic vegetation in our fish ponds.
Seems like the world is always changing, and like the weather in Kansas, change is inevitable. Mobile technology improves the lives of everyone, not just those living in a city. Nex-Tech Wireless is right there with you, providing expanded LTE coverage for everything from phones to farm equipment. We are devoted to help Kansas work smarter and live better. Nex-Tech Wireless. Time for something different.
Well, we're going to jump into our second segment here with Charlie Lee. He's our K-State Extension Wildlife Specialist, and we're going to talk about the benefits of aquatic vegetation in fish ponds. And then also one of the downers of having fish ponds is sometimes all the aquatic weeds that seem to get very proliferant in our ponds. So Charlie, go ahead and tell us about some of the benefits of the aquatic vegetation.
Well, most people want a farm pond that looks like a swimming pool, and something that is that clear to the bottom has a lot of problems and it's not very productive. But aquatic vegetation is important in a pond. You know, that aquatic vegetation starts, that's the primary producers for the pond. They provide food and shelter for fish and other species that are utilizing your pond. And the most important part is that phytoplankton is producing the oxygen for the pond. Very little oxygen is added to the pond with wind blowing across the top. So aquatic plants typically slow some of the water as it's entering the pond. They trap the silt so it improves the water quality. The nutrients that are used by those aquatic plants then are not available for algae, so it also improves water clarity. So those are the benefits of aquatic vegetation, but many people overlook them, think only of the problems with aquatic weeds. Mm-hmm. And typically, I don't encourage anyone to get excited about controlling aquatic weeds until the pond is about 25% or more covered with aquatic plants. There's several different types of control that can be utilized. You can use physical control, mechanical, biological, and even chemical. And that last one, chemical, is what most people want to jump in and start with right away.
Right.
There are some problems with too much aquatic vegetation, and I get a lot of questions about aquatic plants and how do we control it. But keep in mind that the main ones are when it interferes with your recreation or your enjoyment of the pond, you perhaps need to start thinking about trying to control the plants. Occasionally we can have too many plants. When those plants die, starts using up excess oxygen with the bacteria decomposing those plants, which then can lower the oxygen level enough in the ponds that the fish begin to die. So there are certainly valid reasons to control aquatic vegetation, but just seeing a few plants around there is probably not a reason to jump into chemical control. You must start to identify the weed species before you know how to manage it. Now, this is not the appropriate time and place to teach aquatic weed identification. There are a lot of self-help things. There's a site here from Texas A&M University called Aquaplant that does a good job of helping people work through plant identification, aquatic plant identification. Once you identify what species you have, you can begin to select a proper technique to manage that species. I prefer to break it down into simpler categories. If you can identify it as an algae or a vascular plant, then you can probably start selecting the right chemicals to control. So algae is simple plants without roots, leaves, or stems. The vascular plants are the ones that you see most frequently. Those are the big items in the pond. They can be several different types as well. Algae is a problematic species in farm ponds. It can come in three types. It can be microscopic. It can be filamentous algae, the small horsehair-like mats that you see there in the bottom. That's one that I get most of the questions about. If I had to select one weed that seems to bother a lot of people, it would be filamentous algae.
They always get stuck on the hooks when you're bringing them, out.
It's neon green in color, floats on the surface as it dies. It's usually actually rooted to the bottom, and then as it breaks off, as it senesces, and then floats to the surface. We also have problems with blue-green algae. That can be a concern. People see their pond turning color. It's usually a proliferation of one-celled plants or microscopic algae. They want to know how you identify whether it's blue-green algae. Well, an easy way that's been described by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment is what they call the jar test. Using rubber gloves, take you a quart jar, take a sample. Let it set on a shelf overnight. If most of the algae settles to the bottom, it's not likely to be blue-green algae. If the algae then comes up to the top and floats on the top, that's much more likely to be blue-green algae. And since blue-green algae has the ability to sometimes produce toxins, people are concerned legitimately about whether blue-green algae is present in a pond. But just this test does not determine whether you would have the toxin present, but merely whether you would have blue-green algae present rather than green algae or many of the other thousands of different types of algae that are present. One type of algae that is very common in farm ponds that really doesn't look like some of those others that I described is called chara. Chara is also described as muskgrass or skunkweed. It has kind of a crunchy, garlic-like odor, and it gets confused with some of the vascular plants. But it's also very common in ponds, and it's really one that causes people concern because they get it mixed up with a vascular plant and then select the wrong chemical. Some of the vascular plants in ponds that cause a lot of problems are duckweed, watermeal. Those are floating on the surface. The submersed plants would be pondweeds, American pondweed, coontail are two species that are pretty problematic. The immersed plants are those that are primarily immersed in the water, arrowhead, water primrose, and then I group the marginal plants like cattails, willow, and cottonwoods as other species that cause people concerns when there's too much of that vegetation in their pond. There's lots of different control options, but the best starts with proper pond construction. If you can if you can increase the steepness of the pond slope of the sides, you can reduce the amount of shallow water that's available. And when you reduce the shallow water that's available in a farm pond by keeping those side slopes to about a 3-to-1 ratio, you can reduce the amount of light that penetrates to the bottom there. And if light can't get all the way to the bottom, it's not as easy for plants to get started growing from the bottom up to the top. Mechanical control can be done by just if you have the ability to manage the water level, either with a water control structure or with a siphon, you can draw it down in the winter, let it stay 2 or 3 feet low during the winter time. Freeze and thaw action will kill a lot of those aquatic plants in about 3 or 4 weeks, and then time to change the water level for next spring. It's a very simple control, but the further west you go, the more difficult it is for those farm ponds to refill.
Yeah.
Physical is a control for some folks, but most people don't want to work that hard, so when you're trying to dig out cattails or something like that in a pond, most people get tired fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And they want to jump to something magic powder, something that's magical right away. They want to know what's the best chemical, and there's really no one chemical that's suitable for all species. So chemical is a control that we need to consider, but biological is control as well. Grass carp or white amur as a triploid species are available. They're not a cure-all, but occasionally they do take some of the problematic species that are causing folks problems. Some of the things that you need to be aware of if you decide to use chemical, and we spend a lot of time talking about the other options, but chemicals is what people want to jump to right away. You need to identify the species of plant, and you must know the volume of the water in the pond. To calculate that volume of the water in the pond, you've got to know the area, then calculate the volume. Most of the labels are, the chemical rate is per acre foot. So unless you know the volume of the pond, you're not going to be able to dose that pond properly with chemicals. Just a selection here on this particular slide of how important it is to know what chemical and what plant you're trying to treat, because they're not, the response is not similar for all of them. There's several charts available from the university publications that illustrate whether it's poor or excellent or good control on various species and various chemical product active ingredients. The rates really vary since most aquatic plant chemicals are small use. There's not a lot of research that's been done on them, and it's fairly expensive. There's not a lot of producers to spread the costs out, so they're fairly pricey. And the cost can vary from just a few dollars per acre all the way up to hundreds of dollars per acre, depending on what plant you use, the rate you use, and what herbicide you've selected. So that's kind of the problems that I've seen from that people have with aquatic plants. Those are a list of the options that they have available to help control them.
And then on those herbicides, they do have to be labeled specifically for aquatic weed control. We saw some very common names that we're familiar with.
Yes, you got to read and follow the label. That's the law, and those active ingredients may be used in other situations, but the one that you use has to have the site of use for aquatic areas on the label.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Charlie. Well, we'll be right back with our last segment on the fish pond management.
At High Plains Podiatry, the team's greatest joy is seeing you doing what you love to do. Dr. Rob Hens addresses all problems of the foot and ankle with leading-edge capabilities. They travel extensively, serving in satellite clinics near you. Their growth in Southwest Nebraska is a direct result of the caring and personal treatment they give their patients. Let High Plains Podiatry bring the pep back in your step. Now seeing patients in Norton and Colby, Kansas. Call today, 877-345-3668.
Well, welcome back. We're back with Charlie Lee, our Extension Wildlife Specialist, who's talking about some different tips for good fish pond management. Charlie, what's the last thing we're going to talk about today?
Well, some folks have problems with animals in their pond. Typically, that can include the mammals, but oftentimes it's rough fish, species that they don't want in the pond that can overpopulate, like yellow bullheads, common carp. And there's no good way to get those out of a pond unless you drain the pond or use a fish toxicant and start over. So that would be making sure that you keep the right species in a pond, but other animals that might be in a pond or pond problems would be water birds. When you get water birds like blue herons in a pond or kingfishers, they're feeding on fish. Those fish species may have been feeding on snails. Those snails have a parasite that's in them, and eventually that parasite ends up in the fish in a grub form. You see them sometimes when you're filleting fish or cleaning fish. They may appear as black pepper spots or sometimes as a little yellow grub. They're not harmful to people if they're consumed when properly cooked, but they're not very attractive. So you want to try to reduce the vegetation in a pond, reduce the snails, and to do that, I typically suggest people add a few red-eared sunfish because they do a good job of feeding snails. They do a good job of feeding on snails. Other problem species for folks in ponds is beaver. Beaver, you see their damage. There's cutting trees, but they also can burrow into the side of the pond, cause erosion. Identifying the damage from beaver is not difficult, but solving some of those beaver problems may be a little more challenging. You start there with trying to put some sort of a barrier between the beaver and the trees that you're trying to protect, or remove the beaver by trapping or shooting. Muskrats is a concern typically further east, but not a major problem. Waterfowl, Canada geese occasionally can congregate in high numbers on ponds, come out and graze on the lawn, cause problems for folks as well. And turtles is kind of the last one. Turtles cause problems, but really not anything major. The control options for turtles is really just to kind of keep the levees mowed short. They don't have as good a place to lay eggs. Routinely drain ponds so that you can reduce the number of turtles. And then if necessary, you can capture turtles by trapping or by fishing them out of a pond. With that, that's kind of the problems that I see with ponds. I don't get many people to call me say, hey, I've got a great pond. They call me with pond problems, and there's a lot of enjoyment for farm ponds. And one of the best things out there is when you get kids that are really excited about fishing.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, they can provide a lot of enjoyment, but like you say, there is some work involved in managing them. And then you've got up there on the screen your contact info in case you've got some questions for Charlie. Also, I know you've got information on the K-State Research and Extension website. I believe there's some, maybe you need to put in wildlife library, I think, and that may take you there. In Texas Park, or not Texas, Kansas Parks and Wildlife also has some good information on fish pond management as well. Okay,
right.
This has been Stacy Campbell with the Cottonwood Extension District and Charlie Lee, K-State Extension Wildlife Specialist. We appreciate your time.